And I just want to welcome everyone to our March event of our 2021 webinar series for ITS Michigan. Today we have Wejo with us and we're presenting on big data, specifically focusing on mobility and safety solutions for cities and states. And Wejo had, we've worked with them on a couple of potential opportunities in the past. And I felt like that this specific topic is of extreme interest to our ITS members and other members here within the community. Thank you for your patience and thank you for actually joining on such short notice. We've had a few delays and I got vaccinated on Monday, so that kind of also threw a small wrench in the wheel. But with that said, I do want to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it on our YouTube site, so we have an official YouTube page where we've been posting all our webinars. Please feel free to go back and watch them at your leisure as well. Additionally, I do want to mention just some housekeeping items. Please keep yourself muted while the presentation is going. If you have any questions, the Wejo group would love to answer them at the end. So please use the chat feature.
Join the meeting.
You can just click on the chat item on the bottom and type it in. If you don't see it, it may be under more. So you have to click the 3 buttons on the right and select the chat from that drop-down menu. Besides that, again, we're super excited about this. I do want to encourage everyone who's attending to please follow us on social media. We're relatively active and we keep our members and our friends and up to date on the latest details that are happening. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn as a group, and also on YouTube now. I'm not sure about the Instagram. We may be on Instagram, but that's still kind of in the works. I do want to thank Jeff Feeney, Craig, Victor, Brian, Belinda Beard, everyone who made this possible here today. I'm sure I may have missed a couple of names. This would not have been possible without them. So with that said, I'm going to be introducing our two presenters. Garrett and Matt will provide an overview of Wejo and how the largest unique data source of its kind is being used within traffic and transportation for use cases in the US. They're going to be demonstrating new possibilities for data assets and insights, or supplementing traditional data sources for future implications. Garrett is a VP of sales with Data Egress team. He has also spent time on the data ingestion side of business, working directly with OEMs to shape the type of connected vehicle data that is and will be available in the future. We also have with us today Matt. He's a tenured Wejo employee, and he had worked in a variety of roles across the business. He currently forms the solution engineering team, spanning multiple business functions from commercial to technology. His knowledge of applications and uses of connected vehicle data means that he works very closely with both OEMs and clients within the Wejo pipeline. Thank you very much to both for agreeing to be to present to us here today. We do have a general items to, a few items to discuss, but I'll pass it on now to Garrett so you can take us through this. Garrett, to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. I'll just bring up my screen, guys, so bear with me 1 second. So first of all, can I just confirm that you can see that screen, Tony? I'm seeing the nod by Matt. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's great to see such a big audience for this. We really do appreciate, there was quite late notice of this actual webinar that we're doing. So it's great to see such a big crowd. As Tony mentioned, the way that we formatted this session is to give you an overview of Wejo. Who are we? Why are we having this conversation? What do we do and why? We're then going to look into more of a use case focus. So we very much want you to understand and realize where the power of big data, whether it be Wejo or other providers in the market, can actually facilitate the various use cases. And hopefully, you will always come to Wejo for those use cases. But then also the future of big data. So what are Wejo doing and what are we looking for in the next few years and how can that data be applied? And a big part of these sessions is very much the Q&A and that discussion forum. So a few weeks ago, me and Matt actually delivered a very similar presentation to ITS Midwest, and the majority of that session was very much a Q&A session. So people can really learn and understand the power of Wejo data and how it can be utilized across various use cases, across various different markets and sectors. So on that note, guys, I'll go straight into why Wejo, what do we do, why do we do it? So everyone is clear. Wejo does not own or operate any hardware or software that goes into the vehicles or onto the side of the roads. So we don't have hardware, we don't have the software that's embedded in those vehicles. Where Wejo obtains the connected vehicle data is through exclusive partnerships with the global car manufacturers, who I'll refer to as the OEMs as we go through this presentation. And it's through these exclusive agreements across the various OEMs that gives us the power of this data. And where Wejo sits within that landscape is essentially the facilitator from a global capacity to bring all of these car providers together, turn the data into a single common data model. So people like yourselves, when they're trying to access data, you don't have to go through several different sources to obtain this connected vehicle information. So I'll start off with some big numbers, and as I go through the next few slides, I'll start to break down some of these big numbers. So at the moment, currently, live in the United States, we have 10.6 million vehicles, and that equates to roughly about 1.7 billion journeys every single month. At our peak, we see about 400,000 data points ingested per second. The data accuracy is down to 6 decimal places. So for context, that's roughly about 3 meters squared. So we are able to get down to lane level and also parking bay level accuracy. So we have use cases that are specifically within those fields of use as well. The data that we capture from the vehicles is every 1 to 3 seconds. And again, I'll allude to this in a bit more detail in a few more slides. And we have a combination of what we call our raw data and a derivative data products. And then just for some further context, guys, so last month in Michigan, we saw data for 52 million journeys that actually started in the States, and that was roughly about 21 billion data points last month alone. So in terms of where Wejo is actually positioned and how we operate, we collect the data from OEMs and tier 1 providers. Excuse me, guys, 1 second. Sorry about that. And so the connected enabled vehicles and the tier 1 providers, we obtain that data. That is then processed through our Adept platform. So this is Wejo's proprietary data platform, whereby we cleanse and harmonize that data and then facilitate the marketplaces. And the marketplaces vary. So we work directly with state entities, city entities, and all various at all various levels, but then we also work very closely with various different private and public sectors. So our use cases can range from looking at traffic and safety initiatives from the DOT perspective, to mapping and navigation companies, all the way over to the retail sector, whereby someone might be looking at a new site location, and we're helping them from an origin and destination perspective to understand the actual demographics of the people coming into the areas and where they're coming from. So we absolutely span across an array of use cases. So as I mentioned, we receive the data every 1 to 3 seconds. We do have the capability to ingest that data, run it through our Adept platform, and have that data available to end users in what we describe as a live feed. And this is actually available in less than 60 seconds. So that is data from the vehicle into the Wejo platform, into the hands of the end user within 60 seconds. We absolutely appreciate that, that sounds great, but not everyone needs or has the capacity to ingest data on that scale. So what we also do is we can provide derivative bulks of data, whereby we can go back up to now about 22 months. Matt can shake his head or nod if I've got that figure wrong, but we can go back, and what we describe is we can absolutely look at what was happening during COVID, but we can also look past back further than that. So around about May 2019. With all of our data, there's no restrictions on the scale in terms of being able to transport and offload that to people. So if someone was looking at one section of road and they only wanted 1 hour of one section of road in theory, we could absolutely provide that. If someone was looking for the data for the entirety of the United States for the last 2 years, we could also provide that as well. So there's no limitations in terms of our bulk data. But again, we appreciate that all this data is great and big data is absolutely fantastic, but it means absolutely nothing if you can't utilize it. So as well as our big data assets, we also have defined products and customizable reports that fall underneath our mobility intelligence suite, which again, I'll go into in a bit more detail. But essentially, these are derivative data products, which are much easier to ingest. So rather than worrying about billions and trillions of data points, we can formulate more condensed aggregates of these data and provide them in an easier to digest format. We do also have various platforms where people can view our data and experiment with it, almost give it the test drive, as it were, before you go into the big data platforms, such as our data labs environment. So there's full transparency of how dense our data is for the various locations and the various use cases you'd like to explore before there's any licensing of the data. We are also in the final stages of developing our suite of APIs, where we'll have more on-demand access of our data. So we're probably looking at about Q2 to Q3 when this is available. If you do have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. So a big question that we get asked is, well, in terms of the data accuracy, how do you get down to 6 decimal place accuracy compared to other types of telematic providers? Ultimately, the technology in this vehicles, it's embedded at the factory level floor. So that means the parabolic aerial and sim gives us a much greater accuracy with our data versus the types for onboard devices or aftermarket devices or mobile phones, for example. Essentially, the power that is generated from these units and the more advanced technologies that can fit within these vehicles allows us for much greater accuracy. And so what we also are very aware of is, when it comes to either roadside data or roadside cabinets and they're collecting that data, ultimately there's, that level of granularity and that level of accuracy is absolutely fantastic. The challenge that you have with those is you only know you only know the information where those are located. So whether you've got a curbside data point collection, whether it's CCTV footage, they are fantastic, but you only know the data that those are actually looking at. And what Wejo data can do is provide more of that contextual picture. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a few more slides. So we describe our data at Wejo as flavors. So the 2 flavors of data that we have is our vehicle movement and our vehicle events. So first of all, I'll take you through the movement. So in terms of the data that we collect every 1 to 3 seconds is everything that you can see on the screen here. So as I mentioned, we get longitude and latitude down to 6 decimal places, but very importantly, we also get the speed and the heading of the vehicle as well. So what this allows us to do is to make sure within those data points, we have the origin and destination, and we can actually look at these trajectories of these vehicles during the journey from the origin to destination. The reason that we are very clear and we know the origin and destination of these vehicles is we get the ignition status. So we categorically know when the vehicle has started and when it's ended. So then there's no ambiguity from that data. There's no guesswork with the data that Wejo provides. We are not making assumptions. Is it 17 people on a bus where we think that's a traffic jam? We're not thinking is someone that's on a road bike who's going 10 miles an hour is slow moving traffic. We don't have to worry about this. The data that we have is categorically a vehicle. And we know the origin and destination element from that as well. A key question that we do get asked is the level of privacy and how do we obtain this data from the OEMs? A key element of what we do, and I'm sure this will come from the questions, is we are limited to the data that we know of the actual user of these vehicles. So Wejo can only get down to the make, model, and year of the vehicles. We categorically do not know the end users, and we're not a part of that discussion. So the data that Wejo obtains is only data that has been granted access by the owner of that vehicle to that car manufacturer and then subsequently to Wejo. I always like to elaborate on that because I'm sure it's a question that might come up. And then the other flavor that we have is, as I mentioned, is our driving events. So this is almost another name of the sensors that are in the vehicles, or the events that actually occur within these vehicles as well. So I won't name everything that you can see on the screen here, but we have key indicators, so we can start to go into different exciting realms of use cases. So whether it be that weather and climate, or knowing the automatic windscreen wipers coming on, the external temperature. If we're looking at seat occupancy, so we get front seat occupancy and seatbelt status of drivers, which has been widely used in toll lane analysis and diamond road analysis. We can start to look at a safety perspective, so looking at autonomous emergency braking, or actually the harsh braking and harsh acceleration that's occurring in the vehicles. And it's that last point that I'll just pick up on in this clip here. So this is actually data from our vehicles.
Join the meeting.
Whereby to the millisecond timestamp to 6 decimal place accuracy, we can actually see events occurring in the city of Austin over the course of the day of events of harsh braking and harsh acceleration. So this is why I mentioned before that sometimes our data can help provide a much more conceptual picture of what's going on from the traffic in that area. So as an example, did the city of Austin know on this road alone, every single day there's 180 instances of people slamming their brakes on? Potentially not. Maybe at this intersection they did, because they've got some CCTV footage right there, that intersection. But how are they looking conceptually at the rest of the city? If they have got expensive infrastructure that they're putting in place, how are they forming their decisions where to put these either roadside monitors, the CCTV footage actually in the cities? So in some cases, Wejo's data is absolutely being used in isolation, and in other instances, Wejo data is actually helping and supplementing the data for the towns, the cities, the agencies, etc. And then finally, I'll just touch on our derivative data points, derivative products. So as I mentioned, we very much understand that ingesting all these billions and trillions of rows of data is great. If you can't use it, it's no good to anyone. So we are developing a wider suite of derived products, but two that I just highlight on this call is our Journey Intelligence product, which is very much our origin to destination analysis product, whereby we can look at 2 points or maybe a pass-through filter on a road segment, and we can provide an easy to digest format of data. Whereby our traffic intelligence, what we have done with this, we've used our data as that foundation, but we've overlaid a Wejo segmentation model using overlaying it on the OpenStreetMap segmentation model, because we know it's widely used. And we've broken this down by 15-minute chunks of time. And in those road segments at 15-minute chunks of time, we can start to look at the numbers of vehicles, the average speeds, the instances of harsh braking, and the instances of harsh acceleration, and also the stationary traffic as well. So what this allows users to do is ingest that as a CSV format, plug that into their ArcGIS or their Power BI tools, whatever it might be, but it's much easier to ingest. It's not to the absolute fine level of data to that 6 decimal point accuracy, but it's a derivative product whereby people are using this. Especially, we've seen really big uptake on this in the last 12 months, due to people not being able to get out on the roadside due to COVID and then restrictions that they've had. And this has been an absolute lifesaver in some instances, whereby people can get this data in that they just couldn't obtain before that. And again, this is just an example of output whereby plugging in our Journey Intelligence data into a visualization tool. So this is run on a free software called Kepler, and this just indicates just how we can start to look at that origin destination perspective. So that is the Wejo overview. That tells the story about what we do and how do we do it. And I'm very happy to hand over to Matt that will go into more depth of the various different use cases for mobility and safety.
Thanks, Gareth. Yep, pleasure to be here. Good to speak to everybody. So we speak to a lot of agencies and a lot of major municipalities who typically will break their applications down into kind of one of probably typically 2 spaces. You've either got the operations side of things and the planning side of things, but obviously within those applications, you've then got specific use cases. Now, those use cases could be something like signal timing optimization, turn count ratios. It's not an exhaustive list. What we've brought together here is just a few examples of the actual data visualized as we've already seen. So this first one here represents, something that's very, very close to a lot of agencies, which is around the kind of Vision Zero initiative. So what this is essentially looking at is seatbelt usage or seatbelt latch and unlatch along the kind of major arterial roads. And also because of the fact that we couple the seatbelt usage with the speed of the vehicle, we can actually look at people are having instances of unbuckling their seatbelts at quite high speeds in some cases. And again, we're very cognizant of the fact that a lot of cities will have to conduct kind of yearly counts of seatbelt usage. Typically, that's very done by eye, so we can actually start to look at driver seatbelt usage here. And this is all, or the visual that Gareth has already shown, but probably just to add a little bit more context around this. The hard braking and rapid acceleration events that we see from the vehicles, these aren't simply hard, tapping of the brake or tapping of the gas. These are real kind of hard-coded thresholds in the vehicle. So for context, this is either plus or minus 2.67 meters per second squared, if you want to get really technical with it. But that event is actually triggered within the vehicle. And we've actually done a lot of work with the likes of Purdue University, where they've actually seen correlation of about 147 hard braking events is conducive to their having been an accident or going to be an accident. And I'd encourage anybody to look at those studies that have been done. Now, again, when we start to look at the safety element, we are very, very passionate as a business around that mantra of data for good. So actually using data for influencing any kind of safety models or being, playing even a small part in reducing the amount of fatalities is important to us. So what we've done here is we've actually overlaid existing crash data. I think this was from RITIS with the hard braking events. So the red circles that you're seeing are the number of hard braking events over a 24-hour period, and then the triangles are the number of crashes that have actually occurred. But typically, again, when you start to look at crash data, because that's collected by the attending officer, it's not always particularly accurate in terms of the time period that when the incident was supposed to have occurred. There can be actually the crash occurred half a mile down the road, but because these data points that we're collecting are accurate down to that 6 decimal place accuracy, you can probably start to see actually there is real concentrations of hard braking events at specific intersections. And then this is just a couple of examples of work that we've done around work zone mobility. So this was a particularly small work zone in the Florida area, where we were actually able to use connected vehicle data to look at, okay, what did the general speeds look like, and what did the average time spent stationary look like prior to the roadworks taking place versus that first 4 weeks. Now, actually, contrary to popular belief, we saw a huge drop in the amount of average stationary time seen by vehicles when the roadworks were actually in place. Now, that's extremely important for a lot of the big civil engineering firms who have to validate the work that they're doing to make sure actually that it's been properly planned out. And if we move on to the next slide, again, this is looking at the average speed in kilometers. So we're looking, the average speed in kilometers before any roadworks took place is actually a lot, in some cases, quite a bit slower when we start to look at the early hours of the morning. Now, there's obviously various reasons for that. People potentially are looking to avoid that particular road, could be reduced traffic. But again, when you start to look at the general management of that work zone, this is not reliant on any roadside units or any aftermarket devices. This is actually speeds that are being generated by the vehicles themselves. And I think this is the kind of final example. One thing we are very, very open about is the fact that we can actually generate this data in near real time. So to clarify, near real time, that is from the vehicle through the platform and to the end user in under 60 seconds is our official SLA. But this is an example of an actual incident in Portland. Now, what you'll hopefully see in the kind of middle of the screen is fairly free-flowing traffic from east to west, but you'll start to see now the journeys quickly slow down and actually start to stop in some cases. Now, this was actually a major upturned truck which caused mayhem and for hours and hours. And we were actually starting to see vehicles backing up off the actual freeway, the interstate, onto on and off ramps. And that's a real problem for when you start to look at secondary crashes, high speed collisions. But we have the ability to actually be able to visualize that congestion and speeds in near real time. So when you start to look at the applications around traffic management centers, we're seeing real kind of benefits and uptake there.
Thank you, Matt. So when we start to look ahead, both in the shorter term and the longer term of where Wejo is going and the application of connected vehicle data and how that's supporting, I'm going to just touch on how Wejo is operating in this space and our future objections and what we're looking to do, and then I'll pass over to Matt. So in terms of the number of OEMs, so in terms of the car manufacturers by region, we have very I'd say lofty goals in terms of where we're looking to achieve this. What's really interesting is that over the course of the last several years, the relationships that we've had with the global car manufacturers it hasn't been one way. It has not been Wejo reaching out. It's very much a collaborative effort, and we are seen as that preferred partner for those OEMs. It's a very challenging landscape as each OEM is in a different phase of their connected vehicle journey, and what Wejo offers the support for these guys is we have two sides of what we do at Wejo. Very much how our data can help and facilitate the people like yourself, but we very much support the OEMs in their connected vehicle journey and how to obtain the necessary and the vital information from those vehicles, which people like yourself are looking for. So we're already on target, and actually we're exceeding expectations in terms of our onboarding process for new OEMs from both the US perspective, but then also from a global perspective as well. And with that becomes even an even greater level of connected vehicles that we're seeing on our platform. Ultimately, every single day, our numbers will increase as new vehicles leave the factory floor they're purchased, and the older models of vehicles start to leave the roadways. But that happens with the OEMs that we've got, but then with the additional OEMs that we're bringing on board as well, this is where we see that really progressive jump in the number of connected vehicles that we have on our platform as well. And then what's really exciting is the level of detail and the various different sensors and the information that we'll obtain from these connected vehicles. So we're very much looking at the realm, and as I mentioned, we work across numerous new use cases. So whether that be safety, and if we can start to take suspension information from the vehicles, and we can start to take engine diagnostics, but then all the way to in-cabin as well. So the in-cabin media, really starting to understand and how people can facilitate V2V and V2X opportunities in the vehicles. So these are all conversations that we have with people like yourself, but very much internally with the OEMs as well.
So yeah, I think when we kind of start to move on to smart cities, I think it's fair to say that the term smart cities it's a very wide term. When we speak to some municipalities, some agencies, down to private companies. Everybody is developing a smart city solution. Now, a lot of the feedback that we have around smart city initiatives tends to come into kind of three buckets, if you like, which is around the kind of representation, the reliability, and the accuracy of the data that's relied on for a lot of these smart city initiatives. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a lot of these smart city initiatives that are reliant on fleet data. Now, the problem you have with fleet data is it typically will come from a lot of larger heavy goods vehicles, which typically don't drive in inner city areas. They will make their journeys along the main kind of interstates and freeways and arterial roads. And also there's a big question around statistical significance. So there are aggregators out there that will aggregate multiple fleet data together to provide that output, but at that point you start to blur the lines on actually how reliable and how accurate is the data of representing the true driving population. The other piece as well on this is actually when we start to look at driving behavior, again, you start to look at that fleet behavior. It's A to B, occasionally A to C, because 96% of the the vehicles that we have within our fleet are privately owned vehicles, that is actually a benefit for us because it typifies that commuter behavior. And also typically with a lot of aftermarket devices like OBD2 devices and dongles, if it's anything like me, the second that person knows they're being monitored, they will change their driving behavior. We don't have that with a connected vehicle. So just to touch on a couple of last kind of use cases here, we start to look at something like congestion and actually how can we influence congestion through the data. So the fact that we have the speed and the heading at a very basic level with the GPS coordinates, you can actually start to look at bi-directional roads. How is that road behaving on a north to south or south to north comparison? The visual that you can see here, this is just a one-way street, Lavarca Street in Texas. And we've actually visualized this with our traffic intelligence product. So say we were to close down that one-way street, what impact does that have on surrounding roads that join onto that street? So the 1.3 billion journeys, 1.2 billion journeys that we look at each month, all of that feeds into these aggregate products. And then, one kind of, suppose, real final use case, which is certainly close to me, and it's a lot of work, what I've done a lot of work on, is around actual traffic signal timing. So this is just a visual of the Las Vegas Strip here. And at this point, there is nothing particularly out of the ordinary that you can see. But what I would suggest is that just to the left of the visual that you see those red dots on the road. Now that's vehicles within the Wejo fleet that are still transmitting their latitude, longitude, their speed every 3 seconds. So we can actually start to use the data to look at, okay, can we understand what is at least the queue length at that particular intersection? Because the thing is, when we start to look at traffic signal timing, it's reliant on a lot of induction loop data. So actually, those induction loops typically tend to be, 20 yards back from the lights. Actually, if we see a Wejo vehicle 200 yards back, stationary in the middle of the road, potentially, yes, it's broken down, but because of the volume that we have, that over 10 million vehicles, we can actually start to influence those models. So Jonathan, you can wrap us up.
Yeah. So on that note, guys, we've shared Wejo and some of the use cases that that we specifically work on. We wanted to have some targeted use cases which hopefully resonate with you guys. But now is very much it's an open forum, open opportunity whereby if you have any questions for myself and Matt, apologies, I've not been able to look at the chat as I've been going through. So hopefully we've got lots of questions, and we've got the rest of the session to facilitate those. 17, great. Oh,
I'm happy. I think you're on mute, Tony.
I am on mute. Oh, yeah. So I was just saying, thank you very much. Great presentation. We do have a lot of questions. What I'll do is I'll go through them one by one, and hopefully either Garrett or Matt, you guys can take care of them.
Yeah, no problem.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let's start with the first question on here. It came from one of our City of Detroit employees. What do you mean by saying destination as the map is showing moving target vehicles? I believe that was one of the maps where you were showing where the vehicles were going from to with an arch going on top. And he wasn't sure about what it meant by destination.
Yeah, surely. So absolutely. So essentially what we're able to do with the data, because we have the ignition on and ignition off, but then we get the data points in between. In some use cases, people only want to understand where the vehicle originated from, or maybe it passed through a certain road. So if we have a section, one of the use cases that we've looked at many, many times, me and Matt, is Disneyland as the example. So, understanding where people actually originated from. So the end point was Disneyland, but where did they actually start from, and where was that origin? The journey they took in this specific use case for the client that we're working with wasn't so much important. It was more a case of where would these people come from. So what we're able to do from an origin and destination perspective is, if people do not need that in between data points, we can cut those out from the journey start and the journey end.
Okay. Excellent. So we have another question on that one came from me. And what is the format that we can obtain the outcomes of the data? Is it just reports? Is there a Wejo platform? Or, how as an entity, as a private agency or as a public agency, what does this data look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave that one to you, Matt.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so there is a variety of outputs that we can look at providing the data in. Now, for big data agencies, as an example, they have the infrastructure to support what we'll term as kind of raw source data. Now, without going necessarily too technical, that raw source data will typically be in something like a JSON format, very ingestible for a lot of GIS products. Now, as we mentioned before, we also have the ability to provide the data in an aggregate format. So aggregate being a flat CSV file that will provide you with those metrics such as average speed, again, visualized very, very easily in a lot of the commonly held GIS tools like ArcGIS. We are working on building out a front-end UI as well. So that's going to be probably launched in middle of Q2, which is going to start to actually give some initial outputs and a UI that we're conscious a lot of traffic engineers will typically work with. So the initial output for that is probably going to be looking to be something like a turn count tool with a view to us then plug in our intelligence products into that as well. So, we cater for a multitude of infrastructures and capabilities, whether that be CSV files, the raw source data, or a UI that can be interacted with.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question came from Hassan, I believe with Danlaw. Any plans on working with OBUs and RSUs, RSU manufacturers? If so, who does the RSU fits? How does the RSU fit in Wejo equation? So how have you guys thought about, do RSUs provide any valuable data in this case, and how can they fit in to your data?
Yeah, happy to take that one, Gareth.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, so absolutely. So we have spoken to a few RSU manufacturers on the basis that actually there is a real requirement. With a lot of RSUs, they will capture point in time and point in road data, which is great for looking at 100% of vehicles past a particular point. But with a lot of the RSU manufacturers, what they don't know is actually where are we going to put our additional roadside units. So if we're seeing a particular bottleneck through the Wejo data, if we look at even a 5-mile corridor where there's an RSU at one side and an RSU at the other, there's no visibility of what is happening in between that. So actually we're being able to influence those models with RSUs to say, okay, you might want to put a rumble strip here, or you might want to put a feedback sign at this particular point. And also as well, RSU companies, they provide us with the ability to provide ground truth into our own data as well. So, because we can actually say, okay, we know what 100% of AADT is past that particular point, Wejo data represents 12% or whatever that figure might be.
And if I'm not mistaken, Matt, just based on our previous discussions, we can also use our permanent counters to be able to do something similar as well, right? In terms of like my vision in our case, or any other counter that the state or city uses.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So the next question is, how is the data provided by area, city, state? I think it's just a general quick question.
Yeah, so there's no restriction in terms of how we can provide the data from a geographical perspective. All the data that we have at the moment is the entirety of the US, so in every single state. So if someone wanted our raw data for the entirety of the USA, you can have that at the time scale of your choosing. If you only wanted a few intersections of road for our journey intelligence product, you could have that as well. So it's absolutely dependent case by case, and we can accommodate accordingly.
All right, great, thank you. And so the next question is from John Abraham from Macomb. Once the data reaches the public sphere, public agencies, is there a concern that attorneys will be reaching out to get the info via the FOIA's Freedom of Information Act?
So that's a great question. I wish my my legal counsel's on board, but what I can say is that the data that we have, and ultimately our data is first and foremost used for good. So we do have limitations of what our data can be used for and the restrictions that are in place. So we do have robust licensing agreements. That is agreed upon between us and our licensors, which is the OEM, and there will be and there are restricted use cases where our data can be applied. So we work with our clients openly on that, but there is let's say grey or areas that our data just won't supply in. Any further than that, I think I'd need my legal counsel, unless Matt, you can jump in there.
No, I think the only thing I'd add on to that is, as a business, we are very cognizant of things like CCPA, and more recently, I think Virginia have passed more recently their own kind of version of CCPA. So all of the data that we house it's anonymized and it's aggregated. So we don't have the ability to reverse engineer that data, even if we wanted to. And as Gareth has mentioned, we have strict data sharing agreements in place with the OEMs and also with our end clients as well around permitted usage of the data.
So you guys bring up some really good topics, and maybe John, if you want to unmute yourself, it would be interesting to understand what kind of information would they be requesting. In the case of a crash, they may be asking for signal timing, they may be asking for some of the video that's available. But in this particular case, I don't think there's anything that could be litigated or used for litigation. But if you can shed a little bit more light on that, please feel free to do so.
So my question was based on your example. You talked about a truck crash and the circumstances that led to that truck crashing, in your example in Austin. So that would be information. If that is public, then people, if the lawyers know that, hey, there is this information that could be available, they may use it. They may want it, and they may first come up to the public agency with a FOIA request saying, hey, we need that particular data, similar to what you presented on the trucks.
Yeah, and FOIA is something that we do take very seriously internally. I think the one thing to probably note is that particular overturned truck, we are not categorically saying that we have the root cause to that particular incident. Yes, we have context around it in the form of anonymized data. But yeah, I take the point in terms of it's entirely possible that down the line that FOIA could come to the forefront in terms of because of the granularity of data that we have.
All right, so good stuff. So Hassan, if you'd allow me, I'm going to cover your question. I'll come back to your second question. I'm going to go to Yasna's question, who's asking about 10 million vehicles that you had mentioned. Is that worldwide? How many vehicles in Michigan? Do you have those numbers?
Yes, so in terms of all the data and all the information that I've shared, everything has related purely to the USA. So we have 10.6 million vehicles in the USA, 1.6 billion journeys on a monthly basis, and this is all USA at the moment. So we do have, let's say, data outside the USA in the building, which will be live. It will be egressing live soon, but at the moment, all our live data is the US.
And I can probably put a little bit of context around the question around Michigan itself. So I think we shared some figures at the top of the presentation around, we saw around 51 million journeys last month started within Michigan. If we start to look at some of the aggregate tables that we produce each month, somewhere like Detroit, for example, we saw around 150,000 distinct vehicles within Detroit, around 4 million journeys, and just over 1 billion data points. Hopefully that kind of puts a little bit more context around it.
Is that for Detroit last month?
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, great. I just want to put that slide back up there while I ask the next question.
Gareth, I think you.
I'm working on it, Tony.
I have a tendency to put you guys on the spot, but so I'll ask the next question while you guys are pulling that up. Has Wejo been in contact with the Planning Bureau at MDOT? They are typically dealing with the statewide data sets for very specific use cases. And this is from Meredith Nelson at MDOT.
Yeah, so I think from memory, we have had conversations with both the planning and operations side of things at MDOT. Again, very conscious that there's a lot of data sets that are currently being used there, not just, as you say, for specific projects, but actually statewide. The one thing we would say is we're always open to additional conversations with key stakeholders within there. So if there's anybody that you think would be interested to inject into the conversation, then always welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from our end, we've had plenty of discussions with SEMTalk, MDOT, and everyone keeps on saying we need this, but there hasn't been that someone just to push the ball so it can start rolling down the hill. From our perspective, again, we know what's happening at those big intersections around the city, but we don't know what's happening in between. And it would be super powerful if we can come and fill in the gaps. So use those ground truth checks as our calibrators, but then be able to kind of transmit that to other roads, because we have a lot of decision making that goes within that. So it would be super helpful on a city level for sure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Yeah, these are the numbers. So again, this is all US information, and we can share some further details after the call. Happy to share that for you, Tony, to disseminate that to the audience about the latest figures that we see at Wejo, and then we can break those down specifically for your state as well.
Great. And with that said, I'll go back to the rest of the questions, but would you be able to share the slides, maybe with an updated slide for Michigan, and then I can share that?
Yes, that's no problem.
Okay, great. So were you about to say something, Garrett, earlier when I interrupted you?
I think it was just a really interesting point when you mentioned around planning. So a lot of the conversations that me and Matt have had, especially when we start to look at various different cities at all scales, it's really interesting how much of their planning is based on let's politely very old data. So there's decisions being made off either manual traffic counts on a few sections of road that were made 10 years ago. So what we've absolutely seen from our derivative products is the fact that they can get up-to-date data over the last 2 years, essentially delivered to them as soon as they need it. And I always like to use the example is if you only needed data for rush hour traffic every Monday for the last 2 years, effectively we could just provide you that if that's what you needed. So this is where the really good option that we have with our data is we're not defined on scale of geography, but we're also not defined on scale of time either. So if there's only certain days, we can extract that data and supply that as well.
Excellent, thank you. I do want to also mention that although our webinar does end at 1 o'clock, Garrett and Matt did commit to kind of staying a little bit over if needed. So if the questions do go over, we will continue to kind of answer them as we go along. And if you need to drop off, that's fine. The video recording will be available on YouTube in the next week or so. So going back to the questions, again, some great questions going on here. There's a rather long question, but I think it kind of hits on a very important item from Richard. Can you enlighten us more on the journey intelligence product? For example, are you able to infer trip types, example, rideshare, deliveries, etc.? Or also, do you have documentation on the method and assumption for the various insights you're generating? A typical example is how you define harsh brakes. So there's 2 parts to it. Maybe we can start with the first one about the journey intelligence product.
Yeah, Matt, you look poised there to go.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, this is a conversation we've had only this morning around the journey intelligence product and how we are looking to iterate that. So, being open and honest, as that first iteration, we are not going to be looking at journey types. However, what we have been able to do is to actually bucket these journeys into types. So, as an example, it could be commute, it could be something like, and again, all of this is based on actually how proximate that vehicle is to the nearest point of interest. So, if we look at something like a journey that ends in a residential area, we can assume that is a commute. So we have started to look at how we can segment the journey intelligence product into actual journey types. Now, when we start to look at rideshare and deliveries, not to that level, no, purely on the basis that we have privately owned vehicles. And then the second question is around, do you have documentation on the methods and assumptions for various insights you're generating? Yes, we do have product overview sheets, and yes, we do have schema documents. I think it's probably easier, rather than me kind of necessarily talking through them, that we kind of share those afterwards. Yeah.
Fair enough. Great. So we have a question for Prasad, one of my good buddies at work. Can you please talk about your example or examples of how a public agency used your data and what was the outcome. And I would add to that, how did they go about obtaining it? So through a contract or through, through a project, etc. So the question again is, how did a public agency use your data in a practical sense?
Yeah. Do you want to start with the first, Matt, and I'll go with the second half?
By all means. Yeah. So, without necessarily sort of naming any names around the agency themselves, one thing we are very well versed in is actually working through agencies by proxy. So when I say by proxy, I mean a lot of the major civil engineering firms, for example, will have existing task orders with the agencies and with the municipalities that they will use to procure new data sets. Now, probably a good example of this would be the traffic management center example I mentioned before, where we actually worked with a third party civil engineering firm to be able to visualize that data within a dashboard and utilize that real-time or near real-time feed from the Wejo data. So we have experience of working both directly and also by proxy with a lot of the agencies.
Yeah, and in terms of how it works from a commercial perspective, it does absolutely depend on the various projects. So we've worked with some state agencies where they want to work on basically, they make the decision on the historic data that they've seen. So they've purchased a block of historic data from us, and they'll run their own analysis. And then they then may take up the option to then receive data ongoing. And then for other agencies, it's very much been on, let's say, a live subscription. So they've signed up for 6 months to get a live data feed of Wejo's data into their either transportation departments, into the various data analytics programs that they have. So this is, again, hopefully the great aspect of Wejo. We have that flexibility. It's not a restricted contract. It's not a case of you have to sign up for Wejo for 2 years. You can only have ongoing data, or you can only have historic. We're flexible with the needs of anyone that we work with across any marketplaces. If you want if we use Detroit as an example, if the last 12 months of like say that, let's call it the COVID data, if the last 12 months of historic data would be of real interest for you and you can utilize it, but then you'd also like 6 months of ongoing data delivered to you every single day, we can also supply that. So we're not restricted on geography, and we're specifically not restricted on how someone would like to obtain the data from us either.
Excellent. So I'm going to go back to Hassan's email from earlier. So he was talking about the latency, essentially. So he asks, I understand data needs 60 seconds to reach the traffic agency. Does it reach the agency in a 60-second bin? Also, in real-time traffic operation scenario, any plans to drive the 60 seconds down to a lower number?
So this is this is where I might say some numbers, and Matt will correct me here. But from for the latest conversations I've had, so the 60-second SLA is what we have. That's what we commit to and what we commit to our clients to. Typically at the moment, so this is where Matt is going to start shaking his head at me, but typically at the moment, around about 80 to 85% of our data is available to the end user within 20 seconds. But we do have a 60-second SLA in place.
Yeah, and probably just the original part of that question around, does it reach the agency in 60-second bins? No, so it's not sent in what term as a kind of micro batch where it's stored up for 60 seconds and then sent. It's sent on a regular stream from the vehicle. So at the point when that vehicle starts its journey, it's captured every 3 seconds and it's sent within 60 seconds of that data point being generated.
Great, that actually clarifies it. Thank you. So next question from John Abraham. So he's just clarifying that, who are you working with in terms of the OEMs? I'm assuming your partners include the big 3 OEMs in Michigan and other major ones as well.
Yeah, so we can't name who they are on the call. What I can say is we work with one of the largest car manufacturers in the United States, and the other one that we have live on our platform at the moment is a prominent European manufacturer that has a strong presence in the United States.
All right, fair enough. We won't push you more on that. So yeah,
and more to come. That's the I'll close it there, and more to come.
Sounds good. So Yasna, again, always asks difficult questions. So I think said 150,000 unique vehicles in Detroit. I guess I would be concerned that some roads may not be driven on at all. And we kind of saw this or had a discussion about this when we were trying to find the speeds on our local residential roads.
Yep.
So I'll let you guys speak to that a little.
Yeah, I mean, probably just to, I think that the question itself is, so I think you said 150 unique vehicles. Just to clarify, it was 150,000 rather than 150. You know, the one thing we would say is we have representation on around 95% of US roads. So when I say representation, we see at least one snapped data point on a road in a 1 month period. Now, obviously, when you start to look at rural versus urban, that sway will go slightly, but even in some of the lowest areas, so I think from memory, Petroleum County is, for whatever reason, it's our lowest area of density in terms of the data set. And even there, we are able to visualize the road network very, very well. So, you know, I think that the key thing here is where you start to look at actual physical infrastructure and managing traffic congestion through roadside units, it's not viable to have that at every point during a corridor. Whereas with the data, even being able to visualize half a dozen vehicles along an entire corridor is a lot more than it's capable at the moment.
Okay, great. So we have a couple more questions. I do want to remind our attendees that it is 1 o'clock. Please feel free to stay. We're going to try to answer all the questions, and maybe if you want to type in some more, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, you know, we'd be more than happy to do so. So so far we have 2 more questions, but there may be a couple that will trickle in. Our next question is from Steve Remius, Dr. Steve Remius from Wayne State University. From the planning origin destination perspective, when do the waypoints begin and when do they end? Is any clipping filtering done at the beginning and ending of the journeys?
So that, do you want me to go ahead with that, Matt, or are you happy to go? Yeah, I suppose with that, was it Steve, I think that answered that question. So that will depend on the output of the data. So as our journey intelligence product, as an example, being that is our derivative data set, and there's the output that we'll have is we will get down to a zip level of origin, and then we can get down to a POI level of a destination, or either or. What we would be restricted on that is if we only saw one journey, for example, in that area, that would be excluded from that data set. So there needs to be at least 2 vehicles from a zip code or a POI origin or destination. When it comes to our raw data, because we have some, an additional legal framework that sits behind the data security of that, that's when we can start to look at the origin and destination to a more of a specific journey on, journey off, long and latitude perspective.
All right, thank you. And again, I do encourage anyone to raise your hand or unmute yourself and chime in if you have any further question or any further elaboration that you would like to add. So we also have another question from Meredith, again from MDOT, Connected Vehicle Program. Are your customers primarily engineering firms, local government, or state agencies? Which is a good question, but just to understand, where is this data being used?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say yes, they make up probably of the top cohort of people that are utilizing our data. Within there as well will fall mapping and navigation companies, logistic, people where they're obtaining more accurate data from Wejo. But yes, I'd say they form of the top 5 to 10. That the end users of our data currently, yes, that they would absolutely fit in that bracket.
Great. Well, so, John, please.
So one of the reasons I asked about the OEMs is basically to find out, maybe the question can be rephrased to ask you, what's the penetration rate of your data? Are you, say, covering 10% of the, using 10% as the statistically significant sample for your stuff, or are you getting, say, 50% of the vehicles out there?
Perfectly valid question. And again, Matt, that's his poised expression. So it looks like Matt's ready to go.
Yeah, typically we say at the moment our data represents about 1 in every probably 26 vehicles on the road. Now, when we start to look at and I'll attempt to say this without stuttering, statistical significance. We typically, when I've worked with a lot of traffic engineers and ITS engineers, anything from kind of 1.5% to 2.5% upwards provides enough significance to accurately model against. Are the conversations that I consistently have. I think it's fair to say that unless you're using something like a roadside unit, and even then, as we've already mentioned, that covers 100% of vehicles past a point, nobody's going to be capturing 80-90%. And as I think the one thing to point out as well, as Gareth mentioned, the car park that we have will only grow over time as the legacy non-connected vehicles come to end of life, and we onboard more OEMs, and we also onboard more vehicles with the existing OEMs.
Yeah, and I'll just build on that one extra one, John, is the US car manufacturer that we have on board, being who they are, their vehicle sales and our vehicle car park, as we call it, matches very, very closely with the generic car sales across the United States in terms of the distribution, across between pickup truck versus sedan versus two-seater sports car, etc., EV vehicles. That mirrors very, 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 very closely with what we see from our car manufacturers that we have on board at the moment.
Excellent. I do see a number of people still on the call. Please feel free to unmute yourselves and then ask any questions. All right. So Frank, were you going to ask something? Maybe not. Well, again, thank you a lot, Garrett and Matt. It was a pleasure having you with us. I know it's with the time difference, you guys are probably getting ready for bed or so.
Oh, it's early. It's early for us. It's early for us, Tony.
All right. Well, thank you very much again, and we'll definitely be in touch. I'm glad that this conversation started off here through ITS Michigan. Again,
yeah,
we'll
absolutely,
see.
guys.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye now.